On a brisk April afternoon in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Robert Mitchell was simply driving home from a job site when something in a quiet suburban driveway stopped him cold. There, gleaming in the sunlight, sat a silver Lexus, the same one that should have been parked safely in his own garage. His wife of 27 years, Linda Mitchell, had told him she'd be at work until evening. Yet here was her car, parked at the home of Paul Richardson, Robert's son-in-law. Robert's mind raced. His daughter, Sarah Richardson, had cheerfully told him earlier that she wasn't home, but that Paul was working on some case files. Still, something felt off. The kind of off that tightens your chest and makes the hairs on your arms stand up. Instead of knocking on the door, Robert eased his pickup down the block, parked out of sight, and walked back quietly. As he drew near an open side window, voices carried out, familiar voices. He froze, listening. Linda's light, almost playful tone drifted into the cool air. Paul's deeper, confident voice followed. In seconds, Robert realized they weren't talking about family or work. They were mapping out a future together that left no place for him. A future built on dismantling his marriage, claiming half his fortune and leaving him with nothing. Robert's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. One tap on the record button, and every word, every cruel laugh began capturing the betrayal that would turn his world upside down and set the stage for a battle none of them could have predicted. Robert stayed frozen outside that window, his heart pounding so hard he feared they might hear it. He strained to catch every word between Linda and Paul, piecing together a truth so outrageous it almost felt surreal. Paul, with the easy confidence of a man who thought he was in complete control, was laying out their timeline. File in June. Claim irreconcilable differences, Paul said, his tone crisp, almost smug. Under Iowa statutes, Linda gets half of everything acquired during the marriage, plus lifetime spousal support. Robert's stomach turned when he heard Linda laugh. That soft, tinkling laugh he'd once loved. Now it sounded cold, calculated. The construction company alone is worth over $12 million, she said, her voice almost giddy. Add the rentals, the lake house, and the investments, we're looking at close to $20 million total. Paul leaned in, lowering his voice. But not enough to escape Robert's ears. The best part? He has no idea we've been documenting his assets for months. Bank statements, property deeds, business valuations, all copied. He gestured toward a manila folder on the coffee table. He practically handed us the keys to his kingdom. Robert's jaw clenched. They weren't just planning a divorce. They'd been running a covert reconnaissance mission in his own home, and then came the cruelest blow of all. Linda, casually examining her nails, added 2 years of playing the devoted wife. Listening to his boring work stories, nodding. At his worries over payroll, God, the man actually believes I love him. That sentence hit like a steel beam to the chest. 27 years of shared life, their wedding day, Sarah's birth, the countless holidays, the anniversaries suddenly reframed as nothing more than a long con. Robert gripped his phone tighter, the record button still glowing red. If his marriage had been a stage, Linda had been the lead actress. And he'd been the unwitting audience. A twig snapped under his boot, making both conspirators pause. Did you hear that? Linda asked sharply. Probably the neighbor's cat, Paul replied. Robert pressed himself against the brick wall until they resumed speaking, careful not to give himself away. By the time he made it back to his truck, 15 minutes later, the world felt different. The woman he trusted with every secret and sacrifice was plotting with her son-in-law, a man he'd once welcomed into the family to dismantle everything he had built. And worst of all, Sarah, his only daughter, had no idea her own husband was betraying her father. Robert didn't drive straight home. He sat in the cab, staring at his work-worn hands on the steering wheel. These were the same hands that had built Mitchell Construction from the ground up, starting with nothing more than a rusted pickup, a battered toolbox, and a stubborn belief that hard work could build not just structures, but a legacy. Those hands had paid for the Lexus in Linda's driveway, the down payment on Paul and Sarah's house, and every comfort Linda had ever wanted now. Those same hands would have to protect it all. He thought back to the early days with Linda, the candlelit dinners when money was tight, her excitement when they bought their first home, the tears of joy when Sarah was born. Somewhere along the way, those moments had been replaced by country club memberships, luxury vacations, and an endless appetite for what's next. He'd chalked it up to ambition, maybe a desire to keep up with their social circle. But now, he saw it for what it was: positioning, sliding the gear shift into drive. Robert felt the first wave of shock give way to something steadier, colder. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. They thought he was a man who trusted, blindly, who would walk into their trap without a fight. But they'd underestimated him. Robert Mitchell hadn't spent 3 decades building an empire in the cutthroat construction business without learning how to read people, plan several moves ahead, and protect his assets. Linda and Paul had started a game they didn't realize he could play better. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced at the phone on the seat beside him. 43 minutes of crystal-clear audio. It was more than proof, it was leverage. And in Robert's hands, leverage was the one tool he knew how to use better than anyone. The battle hadn't even begun. But he already knew one thing for certain. They were expecting to take him down quietly. Instead, they were about to discover what it meant to go up against a man who'd built his life, brick by brick, and wasn't about to let anyone tear it down without a fight. Robert drove the rest of the way home in silence, his mind turning over the events like blueprints spread across a drafting table. He didn't rage, didn't slam the steering wheel, didn't pull into the driveway ready to shout accusations. That was what they'd expect from a man blindsided by betrayal, a burst of emotion, a loss of control. And if Robert Mitchell had learned anything in 3 decades of running Mitchell Construction, it was that control was everything. When he stepped inside his home, the familiar warmth of the place felt strangely hollow. This was the house he'd built with his own hands 25 years ago. Every board and nail chosen with care, every room designed for the life he thought he'd be sharing with Linda. Now he knew those walls had been the backdrop to a performance. A long, calculated act designed to keep him working, earning, and never questioning. He set his phone on the desk in his study, replaying the recording once more. Every sentence, every mocking laugh, every legal term Paul had rattled off became a piece of evidence. Robert wasn't just a husband anymore. He was a man under siege, and his home office would become his war room. The first call he made was to his accountant, a man he trusted like a brother. "Mark, I need a full review of all joint accounts, all credit lines, and anything Linda has her name on," Robert said. His voice was calm, but underneath was a steel edge. "I want every asset protected by the end of the week." Following afternoon, Robert had frozen every shared account. Legally, he had every right joint accounts could be restricted by either party during marital discord. It was an ordinary business precaution, wrapped in the language of estate planning. Linda wouldn't see it that way, of course, but Robert didn't care. While the bank processed the holds, Robert dug deeper. Reviewing statements, he spotted something that made his jaw tighten. $49,000 siphoned into an account he didn't recognize. The beneficiary: Paul Richardson. They hadn't even tried to hide it under a corporate name. That money had been funneled out over 8 months in small increments, disguised as miscellaneous household expenses. Robert's next move was to bring in Mike Holloway, a private investigator who had done background checks on subcontractors for him in the past. Within 48 hours, Mike came back with a gold mine. Paul was drowning in debt, $185,000 in student loans, leased office he couldn't afford, and 2 ethics complaints from the state bar in the past year for questionable handling of client funds. Nothing had stuck yet, but the stains were there. Robert studied the PI's report late into the night, same way he'd study engineering plans before a major build. Weak points, stress loads, structural vulnerabilities, in this case Paul's entire professional reputation was a structure already sagging under its own weight. One good push, and the whole thing would collapse, but Robert wasn't going to push too soon. Timing mattered. He'd let Linda and Paul believe they were still in control, let them think their scheme was moving along undetected. Meanwhile, he'd be laying foundations for a counterattack they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. In the days that followed, Robert kept his routine. He went to the job sites, met with clients, attended Chamber of Commerce luncheons. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than usual. A calculated choice. Linda had always been skilled at reading his moods. If she sensed nothing was wrong, she'd continue as planned. Then, 3 days after freezing the accounts, his phone rang. Robert. Linda's voice was tight, almost breathless. My card was declined at lunch. The bank says there's a security hold. Robert leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the framing crew hammering away on the new medical center project. Security hold? That sounds serious. Did they say why? They just said all joint account holders have to verify their identity in person? This is embarrassing, Robert. I was sitting there with the girls from the club. I'll call the bank. Robert interrupted, his tone polite but distant. I'm sure it's just a glitch. He didn't call the bank. Instead, he smiled to himself. The first cracks had appeared in their confidence, and he intended to widen them until the whole conspiracy caved in. Linda thought she was moving her chess pieces into position. Robert was already several moves ahead, and unlike her, he knew exactly how the game would end. The day after Linda's panicked call, Robert's phone lit up with a name that made him pause. Sarah. His daughter's voice carried that careful, measured tone he recognized from her work as a psychologist. Dad, I need to ask you something, she began. Is everything okay between you and Mom? There's been this weird tension, and Paul's been asking me strange questions about your company, like who controls what assets and how your partnerships work. It feels like he's fishing for information. Robert's grip on the phone tightened, though his voice stayed even. Probably just curiosity about the business world, he said. Your mother's always been interested in financial security. Maybe, Sarah replied, unconvinced. But if something was really wrong, you'd tell me, right? He hesitated, feeling the weight of the truth pressing against the back of his throat. Telling her would mean shattering not just her trust in Paul, but her image of her mother. Of course, he said finally, everything's fine. But inside, Robert knew that wasn't enough. If Sarah was noticing patterns, then Paul's fishing expedition was more aggressive than he'd thought. It was time to control the information they were getting and give them exactly what he wanted them to believe. That evening, Robert called. His longtime accountant, Sarah Chen, she'd been with him through good years, lean years, and everything in between. I'm ready to move forward with that asset protection we talked about, he told her. This is about more than estate planning, isn't it? She asked. You could say that? Within 48 hours, the first phase of Robert's counterattack was complete. Offshore accounts, completely legal, fully documented, were placed behind layers of protection invisible to any casual audit. His most valuable assets were now untouchable, shielded by a structure Paul and Linda wouldn't even know existed, while Sarah Chen worked the numbers. Robert dug into the $49,000 Linda had funneled away. The trail led straight to a joint savings account with Paul's name on it. Bank statements painted a picture that made Robert's stomach turn. Luxury lunches at Riverside Country Club, spa treatments, high-end clothing boutiques, and all of it timed to match Linda's so-called book club meetings. Mike Holloway, his private investigator, was also delivering updates. Paul's financial problems were worse than Robert had imagined. Mounting debt, unpaid obligations to contractors, and a growing whisper network in the legal community about his unreliability. One contractor summed it up over coffee. Paul's got champagne taste on a beer budget, and he's not above stiffing people to cover the difference. Robert read every page of the reports like they were blueprints to a skyscraper. Every debt, every unpaid bill, every ethics complaint was another weak beam in the structure Paul had built for himself. All Robert had to do was remove the right supports, and the whole thing would collapse. Then came the moment he'd been preparing for. Sarah, his daughter, called again, her voice different this time, heavier. Dad, I think Mom's trying to use me. She's been hinting that you're controlling, that you've been restricting her access to money. She wants me to back her up professionally to make it sound like abuse. Robert's chest tightened. And what do you think? I think she's manipulating me, Sarah said firmly. I want to hear your side, all of it. There was no hesitation this time. Robert invited her to his office. When she arrived, he handed her his phone and pressed play. For 43 minutes, she listened to her mother and husband casually dismantle the life she thought they'd built together. By the end, Sarah's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but steady. "I choose truth over family loyalty," she said. "And the truth is, you're the one being targeted here. My marriage is over, Dad." Robert felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He hadn't wanted his daughter to bear this, but now she stood beside him, clear-eyed and resolute. They didn't know it yet, but Linda and Paul had just lost their most valuable pawn. And Robert, he'd just gained his strongest ally. The board was set, the pieces in motion, and this time, the next move belonged entirely to him. By the time the weekend rolled around, Robert could feel the winds shifting. Word had a way of traveling fast in Cedar Falls, especially in the circles where Linda thrived, the luncheons, charity committees, and country club events that she treated like a second job. It didn't take much to plant the seeds. Casual word over coffee with the bank president, quietly shared family difficulty with the Chamber of Commerce board. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just enough for people to start asking their own questions. By Saturday morning, Linda's social foundation was cracking. At the Riverside Country Club brunch, women she'd known for years suddenly had pressing phone calls or avoided eye contact. Her bridge partner of 5 years wouldn't even acknowledge her. The planning committee she'd chaired for the annual gala forgot to notify her of a meeting. For someone who measured her worth in invitations and whispered gossip, this was a public humiliation she couldn't hide. Meanwhile, Paul's professional world was collapsing just as quickly. Robert's quiet networking in the construction community had done its work. 3 of Paul's biggest clients terminated their contracts, each citing concerns about professional judgment. Then came the real blow, a notice from the state bar association informing Paul of an expedited ethics hearing over mishandling client trust accounts. Robert hadn't fabricated anything. He simply connected the right people with the truth. Contractors Paul had stiffed for months were more than happy to talk, and the amounts owed $7,400 here, $9,200 there, painted a clear picture of a man who treated other people's money as his own. The Bar Association wanted full financial records going back 18 months. And Robert knew that was a paper trail Paul couldn't explain away. Linda must have felt the walls closing in, because that Sunday night, she called Paul from their shared apartment in a panic. "Everyone knows, Paul," she hissed, loud enough for their next-door neighbor to overhear. "I can't show my face anywhere." Paul's response was all lawyer, no comfort. Then Monday morning, we hit him hard. Emergency motions, restraining orders, spousal support, make him play defense. What neither of them realized was that Robert was already prepared for that very move. Every account freeze, every document, every recorded conversation had been logged, dated, and stored in multiple secure locations. They could file whatever they wanted, and in doing so, they'd walk straight into the evidence trap Robert had been setting all along by Monday morning. Linda was sitting in a high-rise conference room across from divorce attorney Linda Hawthorne, known for her scorched-earth tactics. But even Hawthorne seemed unimpressed once she reviewed the materials. "Your husband's financial protections are solid," she told Linda. "Restricting joint accounts during marital discord is entirely legal." Linda tried to pivot to emotional abuse claims, but her examples were weak. No threats. No physical intimidation. No isolation from friends. Hawthorne asked for documentation. Linda had none. The only evidence she could offer was Robert's supposed stinginess, which didn't square with decades of luxury living. Across town, Paul was having his own Monday morning reckoning. The bar investigator's questions cut straight to the heart of his problem. Where were the funds that should have been paid to contractors months ago? When the investigator revealed they'd already spoken to those contractors and had copies of settlement documents proving Paul had been paid by his client, the color drained from his face. That night, Paul and Linda met in his nearly empty office, surrounded by stacks of files. Their voices were tight, urgent. Linda pushed for false domestic violence allegations. Paul reminded her it was a felony if proven false. Linda countered that they were already facing ruin. At least this way, we go down fighting.
Robert
Didn't need to hear the rest. His private investigator was listening through the building's ventilation system, recording every word. By Thursday, when they stepped into court with their fabricated narrative, Robert's attorney would be ready. What Linda and Paul still didn't understand was that this wasn't a man scrambling to save himself. This was a builder, a man who knew the value of a solid foundation in every move he'd made in the past. 2 weeks had been laying the groundwork for their complete collapse. The game was no longer about defense. Robert Mitchell was about to go on the offensive, and in Cedar Falls, that meant one thing. When the dust settled, only one structure would still be standing. It wouldn't be theirs. Thursday morning broke clear and cold, the kind of Midwestern spring day where the air feels sharp enough to cut. Robert Mitchell arrived at the Davenport County Courthouse early, dressed in his best Navy suit, the same one he'd worn to close. Multi-million-dollar construction deals. This wasn't just a legal hearing, it was the culmination of 2 weeks of quiet, meticulous work. Today, Linda and Paul's carefully built facade would crack wide open in courtroom 3B. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table with her high-powered divorce attorney, Linda Hawthorne. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a conservative navy dress, minimal makeup, and the nervous demeanor of a woman playing the role of the wronged, frightened wife. Paul sat a few rows back, his silver tie perfectly knotted, wearing the smug expression of a man convinced the system was about to do his bidding. Judge Patricia Hendricks, seasoned presence on the bench, opened the session with no nonsense. Efficiency. Mrs. Mitchell, she began, you've petitioned for an emergency restraining order, citing financial abuse and intimidation. Please explain your concerns. Linda's voice trembled convincingly. Robert admitted as she spun her story. She claimed Robert had been restricting her access to money, monitoring her spending, making vague threats about what would happen if she tried to leave. She painted herself as a woman trapped in a gilded cage, suddenly stripped of her means. To survive? When she finished, Hawthorne nodded toward Robert's attorney, James Whitaker, who rose with calm authority. Your Honor, Whitaker said, we have evidence these claims are not only false, but part of a deliberate conspiracy to defraud my client of marital assets. Hendricks raised an eyebrow. That's a serious allegation, Counselor. Whitaker connected his phone to the courtroom audio system. I'd like to submit Exhibit A, a recording made by Mr. Mitchell 2 weeks ago. The first voice, too. Filled the courtroom was Linda's. When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for. The shift in the room was immediate. Hawthorne stiffened. Paul's eyes flicked toward the exit. For 43 uninterrupted minutes, the judge and everyone present listened to Linda and Paul's voices outlining their strategy, the asset division, the fake victim narrative, the plan to manipulate Sarah's professional credibility, even the cruel aside, God, the man actually believes I love him. By the time the recording ended, Linda's carefully constructed victim mask had all but collapsed. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her tone icy. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any response to this evidence? Linda opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her attorney, realizing the damage was irreversible, quietly asked to withdraw from the case, citing circumstances not disclosed at the time of engagement. The judge granted the motion on the spot. I am dismissing your petition. With prejudice, Hendricks announced, and referring this matter to the district attorney for potential perjury charges. The gavel struck, and just like that, the restraining order, their key to seizing control, was dead. 2 weeks later, the divorce settlement was finalized under the terms of a prenuptial agreement Linda had signed nearly 3 decades earlier. Back when Robert was just a hard-working builder with a dream, she left with only a modest portion of liquid assets and her personal belongings. For Paul, the fallout was worse. The Bar Association hearing uncovered $127,000 in missing client funds. His license was revoked permanently, forcing him to leave Cedar Falls and take a paralegal job in another state. Sarah kept her word. She filed for divorce from Paul the day after the hearing and began rebuilding her psychology practice, this time specializing in helping families identify patterns of manipulation. 6 months later, Robert's home was quieter, but the peace was real. The house he'd built board by board was now free of performance and pretense. He spent his mornings walking the property, his afternoons at job sites, and his evenings enjoying a glass of bourbon on the back porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. Linda had once told him he couldn't spot a conspiracy if it wore a neon sign. She'd been wrong. The man she tried to break had built something stronger than she could touch, and for Robert Mitchell, that was victory enough. The morning after the courtroom showdown, Cedar Falls felt different. Robert Mitchell woke to a sense of finality, not because the divorce was over yet, but because the tide had turned so completely in his favor that Linda and Paul's defeat was now inevitable. The truth wasn't just on his side, it was public, undeniable, and carried the weight of a 43-minute recording that had already begun to circulate quietly among the people who mattered in town. For Linda, the damage was immediate and deeply personal. By Saturday brunch at the Riverside Country Club, her social isolation was complete. The same women who had once competed to sit at her table now avoided her entirely. Conversations stopped when she approached. Her bridge partner for 5 years. Linda Patterson mumbled something about needing to focus on the next hand and wouldn't meet her eyes. The charity board she'd chaired for years suddenly restructured without her. Invitations dried up overnight. For a woman who had built her identity on status, appearances, and being in the center of Cedar Falls' social scene, it was a blow she couldn't hide. She returned home that afternoon, tight-lipped and pale, slamming the Lexus door with more force than necessary. Meanwhile, Paul was unraveling just as quickly. The State Bar Association's investigation moved faster than either he or Linda expected. 3 of his biggest clients had already terminated their contracts in the wake of the hearing, citing concerns about ethical conduct. Without their retainers, he was in free fall financially. The bar's request for 18 months of trust account records hung over his head like a guillotine. Robert knew those records would confirm what the contractors had told investigators. Paul had been diverting client funds to cover personal expenses. By Sunday night, the 2 of them were holed up in Paul's half-empty law office, voices low but urgent. Robert didn't need to be there to know what was said. His investigator, Mike Holloway, had ears in the building. The recording captured the desperation perfectly. Linda insisting they go down swinging by filing false domestic violence charges, while warning her that perjury was a felony. In the end, they agreed to push forward with some kind of last-ditch legal move on Thursday. Clinging to the fantasy that they could still turn the narrative in their favor, Robert, sitting in his home office that same evening, reviewed the transcripts. For Mike and shook his head, they still didn't understand. This wasn't a fight for him anymore. No. It was a dismantling, methodical, deliberate, and complete. They weren't just losing the legal battle. They were losing their reputations, their allies, and any illusion of control. On Monday morning, the divorce settlement discussions began in earnest. The prenuptial agreement Linda had signed in the late 90s, back when Robert was still building Mitchell Construction from scratch, was suddenly the most important document in the room. It limited her claim to a modest share of liquid assets and barred her from touching the company, the rental properties, or the lake house. What she once might have dismissed as an afterthought was now the legal anchor holding her to reality. Paul's presence in those negotiations was noticeably muted. The Bar Association had already suspended his license pending a full hearing, and he could no longer act as Linda's counsel. Without his influence, her posturing deflated quickly. The fight went out of her the moment she realized Robert wasn't bluffing, that every piece of evidence he'd presented was admissible, and that any further false claims would only make her legal troubles worse. 2 weeks later, it was done. Linda moved into a modest apartment across town, driving an older sedan she'd purchased after selling the Lexus. Paul, disgraced and disbarred, left Iowa entirely. Taking a paralegal job in Nebraska, Robert's life shifted into something simpler, quieter. The house was his again, not just in the legal sense, but in spirit. Gone were the staged conversations, the constant undercurrent of judgment, the feeling of being managed. In their place was genuine peace. In the end, Linda had been right about one thing. Robert truly had believed she loved him. But But the man she thought was an easy mark had proven himself to be something she hadn't. Accounted for a builder who knew exactly how to take apart a structure when it was rotting from within, and then start fresh on solid ground 6 months. Had passed since the gavel came down in Judge Hendrick's courtroom. The Mitchell house had taken on a different kind of quiet. Not the tense, brittle silence Robert had known in the final years of his marriage, but a steady, peaceful stillness, the kind that let him hear the rain on the windows he'd installed himself back in '98, for the first time in years. Home felt honest. Mitchell Construction was stronger than ever. The scandal, rather than damaging his reputation, had cemented it. Longtime clients saw how Robert had handled betrayal with restraint and strategy, and new clients came on board impressed by the man who could weather both economic downturns and personal storms without losing his footing. Deals that might have taken months to close now wrapped up over a single lunch. It was as if the entire community had decided to close ranks around him. Linda's life, on the other hand, had downsized in every possible way. The woman who once measured her days in brunches, shopping trips, and charity events was now working the sales floor at a mid-range retail store in the Cedar Falls Mall. Word around town was that she avoided eye contact with anyone she recognized. Ducking into the stockroom if a former acquaintance walked in. Silver Lexus had been sold. She drove an aging minivan now, its bumper faded from too many Iowa winters. Paul's fall had been just as sharp. After his permanent disbarment, he'd packed up what was left of his office and moved to Nebraska, taking a paralegal position for a small firm in a strip mall.